Welcome everybody. This is Catapult's webinar series called Closing the Gap. I am Felicia Medallia, and I just want to welcome everybody and say good afternoon to everyone in the UK, good afternoon to everyone in the US, and it's about to be, it's actually now June 18th, 12:04 a.m. for us in Asia. So really early in the morning, in the wee hours of the morning, but nonetheless, I'm really excited to be here just because I feel like this particular webinar is going to come full circle for me. So my name is Felicia Medallia. I'm a sports scientist for Catapult Sports out in Southeast Asia. Before coming into Catapult, I actually met the girl who is in the background of all this, Lydia, who introduced me to Cheryl. When I met Cheryl, I was still an undergrad in college, and now I am hosting a webinar. I'm hosting a webinar, and she is the main speaker. So, without further ado, I will be introducing Cheryl Cox, who is the athletic performance coach at University of California, Berkeley, out in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And yeah, Cheryl, why don't you just kick us off with talking about a little bit about your background and what you do for Cal Berkeley, and also how Catapult, has helped you alongside that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you're at. I'm Cheryl Cox. I am an athletic performance coach at the University of California, Berkeley. The teams that I work with are women's gymnastics, women's crew, and beach volleyball. And then in addition to my strength and conditioning responsibilities, I also oversee and manage UC Berkeley Sports Science Unit. And we provide sports science support for a variety of teams across campus. That can range from football to men and women's basketball, field hockey, the soccers, right? So we support a wide variety of teams. And the primary sports science technology that I oversee and manage is Catapult. And so that's the one that we're heavily invested in, that all of the teams really see a lot of value in, and that we're really trying to continue to grow and develop that part of our intercollegiate athletics department. So for Catapult, it's interesting because it's still relatively new in the scheme of athletic physical performance and physical development, but it's really become like a cornerstone of our training. And I remember when I took over Catapult, I got to Cal in 2015. I was interning with the football program, and we had just gotten Catapult the previous year. So super new, not a lot of experience with it. I really want to say we were the first football program to bring on Catapult. So everybody was still learning this. And I was presented with the opportunity to have a full-time position here in May of 2015. And that's when I was given the opportunity to take over Catapult. And from there, it started the long process of trying to, set up our systems, set up our procedures. What is our workflow, right? How are we distributing the units? How are we washing laundry? How are we attaching it to the football pads? Are we going to have it underneath the football pads, right? All of these really small details that we hadn't set up yet, right? Just because we had just started using the technology and started collecting the data, but we didn't really have any systems in place. So in that first year, I spent a lot of time just figuring out how that was going to work smoothly for us so we can have, great quality collection of data day in and day out. So that way we actually can use it instead of just saying, hey, we're doing this cool tracking, yada, 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 but we're not actually using the data, And so in that first year, in addition to creating those systems, procedures, policies, workflow, whatever we want to refer to it, that's when I started diving deep into the reporting side of it, because I'll be honest, when I took over Catapult, I didn't have a lot of exposure to it. I didn't have a lot of knowledge of this system. And so I took it upon myself to try and figure this out, because I saw that I was going to be the point person and the liaison for this system. And I knew that it was important to get it right from the first try. So that way that the coaches had buy-in, the athletes had buy-in, the university had buy-in, and that way we could keep this going instead of just doing it for 1 year and putting in all this work and then essentially deciding that there was no value for it, And so after years, honestly, we've talked about this. It took me a couple years really to get to the point that we had a system in place that was replicable and that everybody understood. and that I got to a point that reporting was easy, that I could communicate actionable insights to the stakeholders in a language that they understood instead of talking about it from like a really numbers perspective. And now that we've gotten through that, Catapult is a big part of everything that we do, So actually right now, football's and summer workouts, they're actually training on the field right now. And football started with just using it for a couple training sessions, and now football uses it for everything. Anytime that the athletes are on the field, whether it's with athletic performance or whether it's with the coaches, they wear Catapult. So we track anything and everything when they're here training with us, which has been really valuable because, 2015, 2021, right? 6 years of data, like we really have a strong understanding of everybody's individual athlete profile, right? And even if they're coming in as a freshman, we still have trends and averages for that position group. So even if we don't know their specific information, we can say, hey, on average, this is what you're going to be required to do during fall camp or during a practice based on your position's averages from years collected. And so like now Catapult is like a really big part of UC Berkeley's training. Like we couldn't do it any other way. Super important.
Right, right. And I think so you guys started with football, and as you said, it eventually spread across all the other sports because you were able to, do a great job with building that buy-in. So can you just talk a little bit about how you've used that with your women's sports? Because you oversee women's gymnastics, women's crew, and beach volleyball, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, for Catapult, I think, currently right now, those teams don't use Catapult. But, like our field hockey team is really into it, and they've been a user of Catapult from day one. And the thing is with like creating buy-in for this technology, I think people need to realize that it takes time. Like everyone wants to get the latest sports science technology that can gather all this information and give you really great insights into information that you couldn't measure before, right? Like the coach's eye versus
Right,
actual objective information is very different, right? Like both important
right.
components, but like very different. And, creating buy-in takes time. And so I always tell people, be patient, right? Like understand that like when you get this new technology and you're trying to educate the people who are the decision makers and who are allocating budget to repurchase this equipment or are the ones creating the practice schedule and can actually change what they're doing, it takes time for them to buy into it and to truly understand the value of this information because that's not their job, right? The coaches are here to recruit, to evaluate talent, to develop players for the specific position needs on the field. And so the coaches are already super busy and have their plate full of their normal responsibilities that, they're not going to instinctually take up this packet of data that you give them and understand what it
Right.
means and believe that it's valuable, right? So it took years of just having casual conversations with the position coaches or with the football strength and conditioning staff to talk about the data, right? Not necessarily try to find the solution on day one, but try and figure out, okay, so what does all this information mean? Like, what are we trying to get out of this? And how can we manipulate our parameters on Catapult to reflect that information? And how can we get that information simplified and communicated in the coach's language so that they believe there's value in it? And so the thing is like that really takes patience. Honestly, it was like a lot of casual conversations, just talking about it, but not necessarily telling them what to do right off the bat. Is more of giving that information as another modality to see what the kids are doing. And then
Right.
as they start believing and trusting us to use this information appropriately, that's when they start giving you a little bit more control and being like, oh, okay, there is value to this. I understand that this objective information we're tracking can actually help improve performance. So like, let's use it. And so creating buy-in is a process. And I think that people can get a little impatient and antsy and wanting the coaches to be all in and understand the language of sports science right off the bat. But that's not usually the case. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
always not the case, but like traditionally speaking, I found that it takes a lot of time. And if you want to do it right, you just got to be patient and you got to understand it's going to take a year or two until you can actually do something worthwhile with it.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of being patient, I was one of those impatient interns that just, went in the strength and conditioning facility was like, teach me everything you know. But I guess just jumping off of that, like whenever you have, let's say, strength and conditioning interns that join on board, and it's their first time kind of seeing, as you said, like sports technology and sports science in itself is just kind of new to the strength and conditioning field. So how are you able to kind of introduce that concept to them, introduce to them the concept of using technology to be able to elevate, your analysis of sports and, essentially make changes in the weight room?
Yeah, that's a great question because, when I first started in this position, we didn't have any student workers that were specific for sports science. It really was just me doing everything. And I mean, I'm talking everything from laundry, from distribution to collection to live tracking to downloading data to cleaning up the data to creating reports and then passing those reports to the people who needed it and then communicating actionable insights to the right people. And able to continue to grow and develop our sports science unit where we actually have a couple positions that are for student workers at
Mhm.
UC Berkeley, like current students, um, that I can hire and actually pay for their time to support these students. And oftentimes it's 50-50 on the applicants you get, right? Cal actually recently created a data science department. I want to say this major is like within the last 4 years. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, but it's a very new major. And so now what's happening is, the beginning, I would just get applications from just casual students who are looking for a job, right? So when you educate that population, I keep it a little bit more simpler, right? Because they're not necessarily interested in the actual information, like they just have time and they want to have a job that's on campus. And so if that's the type of student that's helping me, it's more about like, hey, this is the system, this is how you use it, but I don't get into the nitty gritty of the numbers unless that's something that they specifically ask for, because it can be a little overwhelming trying to think about the principles and philosophies of
Right.
strength and conditioning and physical preparation and performance. But what's actually starting to happen now, and I'm really excited about, is that I'm getting applications from people who are in the data science department, right? Who are students who have coding skills that are far superior than I ever will, right? Who are actual data students who love numbers, who understand how to manipulate numbers and want to understand how to apply it to training. And so now that that's starting to be the transition and changing, when I bring those students on, that's when we actually, train them how to use the system. And I think for anybody who's used the Catapult system, initially it can be a lot to manage, but once you start doing it after a couple times, you really can master the computer system, from like the basics of tracking, breaking down periods, downloading data and stuff like that. But these new population of students, the data science students, right? Those are the ones that I'm going to start bringing in and being like, hey, we're trying to do this in-depth analysis with this information, but we
Mhm.
don't have the skill set to do the coding and the manipulation of the data on the back end. But you do. Like, how can we work together to get the information we want, right? And that's really where this is going to be going at UC Berkeley, and where we're going to be
Mhm.
developing this program down the road. And so for me, it really depends on like what type of student worker or intern that I'm having help, right? And it changes semester to semester. So football right now, I have my two student workers are just UC Berkeley students that are on campus, right? And like interested in sports, but aren't necessarily data science majors. And that's just because of COVID, right? At least, it's just different everywhere in the world, but at least at Berkeley, it's still really locked down and a lot of students aren't living on campus. So there's just like not a lot of people here. But I've had a bunch of people reach out to me about the fall, being like, hey, I'm in the data science department. Like, I want to be
Mhm.
involved. How can I help you? And so I'm really going to be relying on them and their expertise to help me in the fall, because I can teach them how to use the system and talk about strength and conditioning principles and how like we use information that we track on the field in conjunction with the stress that we're applying to them in the weight room and running on the field. But I'm really going to be relying on them to help teach me on like, how do I code? Like, how do I create statistical analysis that makes sense, right? Because that's just definitely not my strength. So for me, it just depends on like who it is that's coming in, their interests, to make sure I'm not overwhelming them with information that they don't care
Right.
about. And, relying on their strengths, right? Because everybody's going to have a different skill set, even if they're not necessarily a strength and conditioning professional. So it really changes depending on who I have.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even in our conversations prior to this, you mentioned a lot about how at the end of the day, it's about the soft skills and being able to build buy-in. It doesn't matter whether it's your data science intern or your strength and conditioning intern or the football coach or the football strength and conditioning coach or, you know, the other coaches out there. At the end of the day, it's buy-in. So I think I remember when we were having that conversation, you said being able to bridge the gap between strength and conditioning and sports science is to be able to basically mitigate the noise, because sports science or just getting data in general, right? Whenever you get data, there's a lot of noise, and it's being able to mitigate that noise and communicate that properly to the coach where they're like, okay, yeah, I believe in that. Let's keep using that. Let's keep doing this. And that's, that's probably why you guys have been using and doing this for 6 years now, and will continue to be doing it. So yeah, how has your experience been on that, in terms of, how do you continue to mitigate that noise and basically um bridge the gap between sports science and strength and conditioning? Because I think this was the actual reason why I reached out to you in the first place, because I was so intrigued by it. So yeah.
Yeah, and that honestly, I think that is the biggest struggle in strength and conditioning and sports science right now, right? Is I'm not a classically trained sports scientist, right? I don't have my PhD. And so what's happening right now is we're having people come into the industry who are like actual sports scientists who have their PhD, who have spent years doing research and studying this. But if they can't communicate this information in a language that makes sense, it doesn't matter, right? All of this is just a waste of time.
Yeah.
And I think one of the positives, or like a skill set that I bring to this, and why one of the reasons I've had success, is that I, came in as a strength and conditioning coach, right? So I'm trained in that regards, like anatomy, physiology, energy systems, all of that. And then as I learned catapult, right? If you read the research, it's always like, and this is true, right? But they're saying spikes in acute load or big changes in what they're used to is going to lead to injuries. And that is true, right? That is 100% true, right? If you
Yeah.
do more than they're prepared for, the chances of them getting hurt is higher. But what will normally happen is if you just look at the numbers, right, they don't tell you the whole story, right? So if you look at, like, take example for a football practice, right? On Tuesdays in the past, they've used that as a really high day, right? So they're running a lot of distances, they're sprinting a lot of yardage, they're running fast, right? Like that's what they're supposed to be doing, right? And so if you just look at the numbers, right, sometimes there are these huge jumps in what they're used to, right? And if you're looking at it solely from that lens, then you would flag it, right? Like you'd flag every single kid, being like, oh, danger, danger, they're outside their acute to chronic ratio, or, like they did too much today, we need to pull back, right? But if you did that every single time that the data gave you potentially a spike or something that was alarming, you would never practice, right? Like these student
Right.
athletes would be pulled every single day. And we both know the coaches don't want that, right? Like the coaches are here to develop that skill set and those specific needs in that position group, and they need on-field practice time to do that. And so, that is the challenge in and of itself, right? Is trying to filter out, okay, so I see this change in data, I see this spike in data, but is it really important? Like, is this really something that I should be alarmed for? And for me, since I have that strength and conditioning background and I train teams as well, condition them, progressive overload in the weight room, right? Like I know sometimes you want to push, right? Sometimes that spike that might be concerning is what you actually want, right? And so it's not
Mhm.
that we should be alarmed about it and we should be saying like, no, pull back, danger, danger, right? It's actually the appropriate amount of stress that we need to apply for that given day. And oftentimes it's planned, right? And that was the intention. And so for me, if I went to the coaches every single time that I saw something that was outside of their normal, right, they would immediately disregard it. They'd be like, well, this is useless, right? You're telling me I can't practice at
Yeah.
all, right? You're saying that like today they did too much. Well, like that's sports, right? Sometimes like we just have a day where things aren't going right. We got to get more reps, we got to get more practice in. And so therefore they're going to end up be doing more stuff, more work in the actual practice session. And so honestly, that is the biggest thing that I think is lacking, is that like understanding the sports science and the numbers and the research, which is super valuable and super important and is a necessary component to being successful in this job, but also understanding like the other side of like progressive overload, physical preparation and development, and like realizing when you should be alarmed and when you shouldn't be alarmed, right? And that's something that takes time to develop, right? And that takes conversations with the strength and conditioning staff. It takes conversations with the position coaches and trying to figure out, okay, they did this here today, but what's the actual plan going forward, right? And usually on those Tuesdays, if they run too much, I know that Wednesdays is going to be a shorter distance day. And so I'm like, we're fine, right? It balances out, right? This really big jump in change in load is totally okay. And the kids will bounce back
Mhm.
because I know that tomorrow and the days following after that have taken that into account, right? So I'm not going to go to the coach the next day and say, hey, you can't run them because you went too hard on Tuesday, because I know that Wednesday it's already been accounted for and we've already had that conversation to adjust
Right.
accordingly, and the way I've been able to have success with that is it goes back to, those soft skills, right? And that's really the cornerstone, is like, if you cannot communicate this in a way that people understand, nobody's going to do anything with this. Like, they won't care. Like, they will throw those reports in the trash. They will look at it and go, this is too much information. I don't have time for this. You're telling me I can't run. I need to, I need to disregard this. And what's interesting, speaking of this, is initially, like, once I got to the point where I was like, okay, I feel comfortable talking about this information and giving you actionable insights, without trying to say that I know how to practice a football practice plan, right? I'm not going there saying like, I know what's best to develop these football players. I'm not going there saying like, this is the drill you should do. No, this is a bad drill, right? Like, I'm just going there with guidelines saying like, hey, this is where we can help manage this workload, but it's up to you as a coach to figure out how you're going to actually do that. And one of the semesters, that we actually had a changing of the tides, that the coaches really bought into it, is they actually weren't running enough, right? And so I
Mm.
went into the coach and I was like, hey man, I know today was supposed to be a high day, but like, your players did not run enough. They did not run fast enough. And so tomorrow you got to go, man. Like, they need to do more. And as soon as you say that, man, everybody's ears perk up. Like, oh, what? She's not telling me I need to do less. She's actually saying I need to do more. Right. And once we were able to like get to that point where we could have those conversations, the buy-in just went through the roof, right? Because they saw
Yeah.
that it's not me just trying to take away stuff. It's me pulling back when we need to, but also pushing them when they're not getting enough stimulus. And that's been a huge changing point, at least on our side, when they realize like, oh, this data can be used both ways. It's not a negative. It's not trying to pull kids from practice. It's just trying to optimize what they're doing on that given day. And so that's been like a huge shift in like how we change it, is once the coaches started realizing that it can go both ways. It's not just removing it, but also it's saying, hey, we need to do more today.
Right, right. So in terms of like building that buy-in, like you've already built that buy-in with the coaches, but then in terms of, let's say, the players, and I know, like, a lot of players are probably thinking, hey, I wanna keep going, keep at it. Being in Cal Berkeley, being in a very powerhouse school for college athletics, more than ever, like, you're gonna have athletes who are gonna wanna, work the best that they can every single day. And I guess, like, when they see, let's say, some sort of data or some sort of thing, like either pull back or don't do this, or as you said, like any spike, like how are you able to like kind of build buy-in, and how does that look like day to day within, let's say, communicating that to the coaches and communicating that to the athletes? Like, for example, here in Southeast Asia, I know some coaches, make certain dashboards for the athletes to see. Like, do you do something in particular like that, or you keep the student athletes completely out of, like, all this data stuff, and just kind of talk to them about it in conversations?
That's a great question. The athletes here, at UC Berkeley, the athletes here are really smart. Like, they have
Mhm.
questions. They want to understand how this information is being worked, especially if you're putting a unit on them and tracking them. They want to know, like, what are you doing this for? Like, what's the purpose of this? Why am I wearing all this extra equipment uh, when I don't want to, right? Like, what is the value you're getting out of it? And I found that the student athletes here are really interested in the data. They really are. They see me on the field all the time, right? And I've worked with them in a strength and conditioning capacity before. So I've been able to build those relationships with the student athletes where, like, they know who I am, right? And they understand what my job is and what I'm trying to do. So they'll circle by and they'll come talk to me like, hey, Cheryl, like, I want to understand more about, like, you guys are always talking about high velocity yards, right? When we're up on the field practicing. What does that mean, right? Like, why do you guys care about that? And so I mean, because football's a big squad, right? So not everybody cares about it, but I will say a good chunk of them do, right? So, they'll come by my office and I'll talk to them about it, right? Like, hey, these are the reports we're looking at. This is how we are using this data. This is why we're collecting this data, right? This is the value that we are getting from this data. And this is why we are asking you to wear all this extra equipment when perhaps you don't want to. And it's been awesome because now they actually are educated about it, and they'll actually ask questions about it. They'll come by like, what are my high velocity yards today? Cheryl, what was my top speed today? Right. And so then they start getting competitive in it too, right? Because there's so many of them that are being tracked right now that they start getting competitive within their position group and between their position groups. And, in previous summers, I would go through and, you know, publish on a sheet of paper in the locker room, like the top speeds ranked by position group, right? So that they can see where they are. And so for them, they're like, oh man, they actually are looking at this information. Oh, why are you so slow today? Right? I'm gonna beat you next time. And so it starts building this competition between all of them because like they can actually see that information. And so for me, like I'm really big on, they own this data. This is their personal data, right? That's collected on them. Like we are not to share that with anybody without the athlete's expressed permission, right? And so for them, I try to communicate and talk about it as much as possible because I think that they deserve to know. And once they understand what it is, then they start asking questions and then they start being more, compliant and consistent with wearing their stuff because they understand why we're trying to use it. So yeah, the kids here really are interested in it, and some will come by and we'll go over the full reports and talk about everything. And some just come by for a casual conversation and be like, oh, I just want to see what were my numbers today. And I can't speak for every university or institution. And I'm sure at the professional level, it's different, but for college, collegiate athletes, I think it's really awesome that they care about it so much and like they actually check in about it. And it's on me as like the sports science practitioner to actually find a way, again, goes back to that communicating, the soft skills and the buy-in, is find a way to communicate that information to
Mm-hmm.
them in a way that they understand. Because again, it goes back to like we talked about the student workers, some being just casual students and some being data science people. The athletes are the same way, right? We have some that are STEM, super numbers oriented and really want the nitty gritty. And then you have some that just
Yep.
casually want to understand what this information is. And so I've been very fortunate in that regard, in that they really are interested in it and they want to learn more about it. And so it's been makes my job much more interesting because it's not me just like sitting in the corner, like big brother on the computer tracking them. Like we have this open line of communication where like, I'm all about it. Like you come by and ask me, I will sit down and I will talk to you about it
Mm-hmm.
for as much as you want to learn, and that's been just like a really cool part about working with the student athletes here.
That's awesome, and that comes in no shock to me, being the number one public university in the world, having smart students like that, smart student athletes asking you, and that's so funny, like saying like, "What's your velocity spike today?" and whatnot. Like having those student athletes having those conversations. That's just yeah, sounds like a great environment you're in. One question we have a question actually from the audience, and actually forgot to mention this during the start, but for our participants, yeah, feel free to type in any question you want Cheryl to answer on the chat box or the Q&A box. This question is actually, what variable or equation do you utilize to monitor athletes returning to play post-injury, as well as your variable or equation you utilize to evaluate athletes during practice and deciding when to pull them out?
It's That's a good question because if anybody's used the catapult system, right? Like there are infinite options for what you can track, right? What
Yep.
anything and everything that you want to track and get information on, you probably can do it, right? And so it's really overwhelming to try and navigate the system and try and figure out, okay, what are the most important things that we care about? And so over the course of the years for us, we've really dialed it in and we use only a handful of parameters that really guide our day-to-day training because they're the ones that we have found to be most valuable and easy to manipulate and easy to adjust on any given day, and so things like IMA, right? Acceleration, deceleration, change of direction. We use the term high velocity yards. Some people say high speed distance, right? But we look at intensity of running relative to their top speed, right? So it's individualized to every athlete, which I personally believe is much more valuable than standardizing it across the position group. Because, for example, in previous years, we've had wide receivers where one was a track kid, came in with extensive track experience, and his top speed was in like, 23 miles per hour, something crazy high. And then we have another athlete in that same position group whose top speed is maybe 20, right? And so we individualize all of their intensities based off of their individual metrics, right? So that way we can actually adjust it on an individual basis, you know? So we have the high velocity yards, which is a really important one. We have sprinting yards, really, which is like that top speed, the really highest intensity running yards, which we know is like lots of fatigue, lots of CNS fatigue, hamstrings are feeling beat up the next day. We look at top speed because that's, you know, a really valuable metric, and especially during summer conditionings, right? Like that's something that we're actively trying to improve upon throughout the 8 weeks that they're here. Player load we look at, but like player load is more of like a global bird's eye view of what's going on. But just saying like, hey, they did 800 player load today and tomorrow we're trying to go to 600. But like, what is contributing to that player load? Like, how are you going to actually do that, right? Because like, if they're just walking around the field for the entire practice, we can say they have a high player load, but like the intensity of the work that they're completing is actually very minimal. So player load, like, is something that's just like a snapshot to kind of see what's going on. And then you dive deep into like what's actually contributing to that metric. Player load per minute, which is another one that we look at, which, you know, again, like intensity, work rate, you know, was something that's really valuable to look at. And, you know, another one from a global view, which is not as focused on, but is still like interesting, you know, total distance, right? Because I'm always intrigued on just like the total volume of work that they're accumulating, and then diving into the specific intensities of those metrics to figure out like, you know, what that work is coming from. And so, you know, those are some of the basic ones that we use on a day-to-day basis, right? We also have another one that's called like an explosiveness ratio, looking at some metrics, right? And that's one Catapult helped me set up and figure out how to use. And so for us, how we manipulate it, right, is since we have so many years of data, right, both games, practice, camp, right, everything. So we have a idea of what they're going to be required to do, or if they've been tracked for like their entire career here in their senior, then we know exactly what they're going to be asked to do for that specific position and their specific, you know, wide receiver. Are they on the outside? Are they on the inside? Right? Like where do they line up? And that is what influences and dictates how we do it. And, you know, they always say like increase 10% every week, you know, your load and your intensities. But again, that's like a very like broad term, you know, like it's a safe, in my opinion, like I think it's a safe way to do it, right? But obviously each person might be a little bit different depending on their specific situation. So for us is like, you just look at the trends, right? Okay, this is what they're supposed to do. How many weeks do we have to prepare them to get back to that point, right? If we have 4 weeks, right, then you just spread it out like a progression over those 4 weeks to get to that end goal, you know, which means it might be more of an accelerated ramp up if you're really trying to get them back, versus if you have the whole summer, which is 8 weeks, then you can be a little bit more slow and intentional, right? So it's not that we have like a set exact equation that we're using for everybody. It's more of like looking at the totality of the information that we've collected, looking at how much time we have to prepare for them, how many days a week are we training, how many days a week do they have exposure to position practice with coaches or player run practices, right? And then how do you manipulate and have your high days and your low days, right? As we know, alternating those high and low is what keeps the kids adapting and keeps them available for practices, right? Taking into consideration all of those things, that allows us to plan out each individual person's return to play, right? So it's not like a one size fits all person. It's really just like starting with, where are we trying to be, right? Like where are we going, and how are you going to get there in the time allotted for you, right? And that also could be determined on their previous injury history, right? The biggest predictor of future injury is previous injury, right? So if we know a kid's coming back from like a slew of injuries, right, and they have 4 weeks to get up to their like pre-injury levels, their progression might be different because we can't ramp them up as quickly because of their history of injuries, versus if it's like a freshman who has their first injury of their collegiate career, you could probably accelerate the return to play a little bit quicker, right? So I don't like to necessarily give like set, you know, equations and like this is exactly how we do it, because it really depends on the athlete and depends on the time of the year and depends on what we're trying to accomplish out of it.
Right. Yeah. And that's awesome because I mean, even my new clients, where we always just say start with the basic, just start looking at just the volume and density metrics and then work from there. Because as you said, like, it's just really overwhelming when you see like what the system can do and how many parameters you can track. And as you keep saying, like, it's all about, what matters for that athlete, what matters for that position, or what are we actually trying to accomplish. And yeah, that's what I think is just been really the what separates, I guess, like having a performance model that actually makes worthwhile changes over one that just has, all these fancy things, but like things are still the way they are. So yeah, it's awesome. Thank you. And thank you for that question as well. That was I don't know about everyone, but I'm taking notes. My next question is kind of more on the non-traditional path, just it being like a women in sports, and we're elevating women in sports here, people working in women in sports scene. I just wanted to ask because, yeah, since now there's becoming a lot of strides in this industry, but it's for sure still a male dominated industry. The question was like, do you still feel any sort of do you still get intimidated, being in a male dominated industry? And if so, how have you handled that through the years?
That's a great question.
I think I might have asked you this when I first met you.
Yeah. Well, because I think that it's, like you had talked about, in the news, you're seeing all of these women getting these opportunities to work at the professional level across all sports, right? The NBA, the NFL, and soccer, it's starting to become something that's more commonplace. But, I changed careers actually at 25. Prior to this, I was a research scientist. I was working at UC San Francisco studying cardiovascular disease and cholesterol, right? Like, so my actual like education and degree from UC Berkeley was integrative biology, right? Like if you'd asked me when I graduated Cal, like I was going to be a research scientist, saving
Mhm.
the world from something, curing cancer, who knows, right? I was going to be just something like that. And honestly, I didn't even know that this industry was a thing. Like I didn't know strength and conditioning was an industry. Sports science obviously was very new at the time. I graduated from Cal in 2008, so it was still very new. And, I changed careers at 25. I just decided that I was going to pursue something else. And I went back to grad school in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University for a master's degree in exercise science, concentration and strength and conditioning. And that was really my first exposure to this industry. And I remember for my graduate school, it's 2 years. The first year you just do normal coursework, and then your second year you can either do a graduate level internship or you can do a thesis. And so, I decided to make a hard pivot from what was comfortable for me, which is a thesis. That's something that I would have experience with and I knew I could excel in. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to try something I have no experience in, that I know nothing about, and I'm just going to try this out, right? Like, what's the worst that happens? And so I remember I went to Georgetown. All of the men there were all men on staff, right? They had 3 full-time strength and conditioning, and they're all men. And I remember being so nervous because I was like, I don't know anything about this industry, but like, hi, my name is Cheryl. I'd like to intern with you. Is that a possibility? Right. And this is me at like, what, 27, like first time ever being exposed to strength and conditioning. And it was really scary. I'm not going to lie. I was really nervous. I was just like, I know nothing. And I've been very lucky that throughout my career, I've been working with staffs that have really supported and promoted women in this industry and have really given me opportunities to prove myself, right? Like at Georgetown, they were the first ones, one who gave me a shot from somebody who had no experience, who had no clue what I was doing, right? I was the one in like the graduate school, and they're like, hypertrophy, programming. And I'm like, I don't even know what these words mean. And I'm like, what the places is going on, right? I'm looking around being like, do you know what they're talking about? I don't know what's, anyways. And so, like they were the ones that like gave me an opportunity to grow and to learn about this industry. And they're the ones that are like, hey, you know what? We think it'd be good for you to get experience with football. We think it'd be a good experience for you to work with men's basketball, and if you know anything about Georgetown, like that's the sport they're known for, right? Like
Mhm.
men's basketball is like a big time program at Georgetown. And so, I was presented with the opportunity to get exposure with all of these teams as being like the only female there, not really knowing what I'm doing, right? And it was really kind of nervous, like nerve wracking. Like I didn't want to embarrass myself. I wanted to make sure that like I was presenting myself in a professional way that, they would see me as somebody who had information that was valuable to them, like especially for student athletes, right? Like I didn't want them to think that I was just there to clean and reset their weight rooms. I wanted them to see me as a coach, right? And not like a female coach, but just
Right.
like a coach, somebody that can come to and be like, hey, what does my squat look like? Can you provide feedback on that? And they were the first ones that like allowed me to do that. And I'm forever thankful for them. Like I would not be here without them giving me that experience, And I went to Pepperdine for a semester or so, and then I had an opportunity to come to Cal, and I'm an alumna of Cal, so I'm a little biased for this university, go Bears. And, I had an opportunity to come and intern with the football program, right? Like an actual Power 5 football program. And I remember when my current supervisor now called to talk to me about it, I was so nervous on the phone. I was like, oh my God, I'm sitting here. I'm like, I really want to come help you guys out. Like, I'm a little nervous, right? Like, it's going to, I just don't know what to expect. And, you know, again, like I'd already met the staff at a previous strength and conditioning coaching conference. And because of that connection and that networking I had made with them prior to this, me inquiring about an internship, they gave me the opportunity to come, because they had already met me and they knew I vibed with the team
Right.
and the staff and it'd be good, And so I remember being really nervous when I came here because I'm the first female to work with the Cal Berkeley football team, both from the sports science and from a strength and conditioning side. I was their first female intern that they had. And I showed up and it's just me and a bunch of men, right? Football, bunch of men. Strength and conditioning, bunch of men. The coaches, bunch of men, right? And then there's me, 5'3", Cheryl, just rolling up, being like, hello, I'm here. Good morning. And, like really kind of like scary in the beginning because like I knew that this was like such a unique position for me and I really only had one shot to get this right and to present myself as a professional individual, to present myself as a coach, to be that person that could show that females can coach men's sports and work in these male dominated industries and provide value, be an asset, right? Be somebody that can help teach them something new, right? To view the world in a different lens. And so, initially super nervous, if I'm being honest, and, like a little overwhelming. But again, the strength and conditioning staff and my current supervisor, Mike Blasquez, like really supported me and really pushed me to be the best version that I could be, right? And like I never once felt uncomfortable like talking to them or coming to them for questions or uncomfortable or unwelcome at practices. Like they really embraced me and elevated me and gave me the opportunities to prove myself, right? Because like let's be clear, like they're not, nor I would never want this either, right? But they're not just going to like bring me in and say, hey, you're a female, like do whatever you want, right? Like I'm still, like I still need to be competent at what I'm doing, be able to communicate and interact with the student athletes and the coaching staff in a way that I get respect, right? Like I had to come in and demand respect. That's what I always tell females when they enter these industries is that it's difficult. I'm not going to lie. It's not something that like you instinctually know how to do and that it happens on day one, but you have to come in and understand that you are in a unique situation and you have to think about how you conduct yourself differently. And I'm much more aware, like, what am I dressing? Like, what am I wearing? What is my hair looking like? Right? Like all of these things that men don't necessarily have to think about, but I'm very hyper aware of, right? And like I make a conscious effort to present myself in a certain way so that the coaches and the student athletes only can view me as a coach, right? Like that's Cheryl, she's our coach, like we're going to listen to her, right? Like that is like my number one focus, right? Is to make sure that they don't view me as anything other than that. And, it's, I was given the opportunity and I ran with it, right? I honestly was like, all right, this is it. Like, and like I'm loud, I got a big personality, right? Like I just like went into the fire, right? I'm coaching up these athletes, I'm telling them what to do. If they're like not behind the line, I'm calling them out like behind the line, right? And it was almost one of those things where like you had to fake it till you make it, right? Like I was nervous the whole time, but I was like, you just got to do it. I was like, honestly, you just have to do it, right? Like you just have to jump off the edge of this cliff and you just have to be the best version of yourself and let your work speak for itself, And so, now at this point, this is my 6th year going at UC Berkeley. And I don't feel that intimidated about anything anymore. Like, I'm not worried about it. Like, I really feel like I'm just another member of the team, right? Like, I'm just another coach here. I've coached multiple other male athletes here. Like, I've worked with men's crew, men's gymnastics, right? Football. And so men's swimming and diving, and I know that that's something that my boss gives me the opportunity to do because one, he knows I'm a good coach, and two, he trusts me to lead this team in the right direction, and that it doesn't matter that like I'm a female and they're male, but it took a little bit of time for me to really get comfortable with that, and I really just had to demand respect and assert myself and advocate for myself and really just give 110% in everything that I did every single day, right? Like I really just like have so much pride in that. And like, it's so important to me. And like, you have to make a conscious effort to do that every single day, And so that's just, now it's not an issue anymore. But, in the beginning, yeah, it was a little nervous, a little nerve wracking, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can imagine, just being in such a big university setting as well. How many student athletes do you guys have again in Cal?
I want to say it's like 900, somewhere in there. 850 to 950 is probably about the range.
Yeah, probably one of the biggest for sure in the US, correct?
Yeah, if we're not the biggest, we're like number 2 or number 3. I want to say we have 30 sports. I want to say it's a lot. We have a lot.
Right, for sure. My next question is kind of could be also for a lot of the male coaches who are working with female athletes. But yeah, like I think I've asked you this before as well. Like in terms of, your male athletes versus your female athletes, what do you do anything differently? Like do you train them differently? Do you treat them differently? Like how have you kind of managed that, going from let's say all your women's sports, then having to, go over to men's football all of a sudden. Yeah, how do you manage that and just the different kind of personalities there are?
Yeah, and I'm super passionate about this topic. Me and you have talked about this. Oh man, I'm so passionate about this topic. The thing about female athletes is that I think people get nervous that you can't push them hard, right? That like if you push them, they're going to break and crumble and it like, fall into pieces. But in reality, like the female athletes want to be pushed, right? They want to have high standards and expectations. Like they want to win national championships. And so for me, if you talk to any of my student athletes, right? Like I bet you they would say something like, Cheryl's really intense. She demands a lot of us, right? Like she'll get on us if things aren't going well or if we're feeling sorry for ourselves, but she loves us more than we can imagine, And so for me, at the beginning of every single semester, I go in, male, female, doesn't matter who teams I'm working with, it's the same across both, right? Is you set those standards and expectations. You go, hey, this is what our standards and expectations are, and this is what's going to happen if we don't live up to that, right? Something as simple as you're not wearing the right gear. I'd like to set at the beginning, hey, we are a championship program, right? We are trying to win a national championship. And you know how we do that? Right? We do the simple stuff correct. And the simple stuff is you wear the right gear to the right training session and you're on time, right? If we can't even get that right, like why are we even thinking about national championship, right? Let's get step 1 right. And so, they'll know. I'm like, hey, you show up at the wrong time with the wrong gear, I'm gonna send you home. Or I'll send the whole team home, right? Depending on what team it is. So that way they're very clear and I'm very transparent in the beginning so that when we get to these really uncomfortable situations that people get nervous about having conversations with females for, like I can have those tough conversations, right? And they know that I'm not going to be upset if they're mad at me because I'd be like, we talked about this. You knew that this was going to happen, right? You know what our goals are going to be. And you know that I'm going to push you to be the best version of yourself. And sometimes that's going to be really uncomfortable and you're not going to be happy with what I have to say, but that's okay, And the females want that. Like they want to be pushed, right? And I think men
Mhm.
get nervous about that because they're not sure how they're going to respond to it. And they respond well, right? And like a tangent off of that is that I think, another reason why we need more females in athletics is, that representation factor. There's certain things that I can relate to my female teams that the men can't. And it's not like it's their fault, right? But like if we're going to be honest and transparent, right? Like I can talk to them about birth control. I can talk to them about their menstruation. I
Mhm.
can talk to them about all of these like really uncomfortable topics because that's something that I relate to. Body image problems, you know, body positivity, like all these things, right? That like I personally can relate to and have had personal experience with, allows me to relate to them. And, you know, we can have these open, honest conversations about how they're doing as a person, you know. And I think that's what the recipe for success is, right? Is that like they want high standards and expectations, and they want to be pushed, and they want to be held accountable, even if in that moment they're kind of unhappy that you did hold them accountable. They want that, right? But they also at the other time want somebody to, you know, have empathy for them in their situation. And, you know, just because they're having a bad day doesn't mean that they're soft or that they're weak. It's just that, you know, men and women handle and respond to stress differently. And, you know, I've had many female student athletes come into a weight training session or a conditioning session in tears, you know, like just in tears,
Me.
right? And I'm like, right. And I'm like, oh my God, are you okay? Right. And so I know men can get, they don't know, oftentimes like it can be a little nervous because they don't really know what to do. Right. You know, for me, I just give them a big hug pre-COVID times, right? Because right now we're not allowed to do it, but, you know, give them a big hug and just be like, hey, how are you doing? Right. And instead of me judging them for that and being like, oh, you're soft and weak, why are you crying? Buck up. Right. It's more of like, hey, it's okay. Like, take a second. Let's talk about it. Like, catch your breath. If you need a couple minutes, just like go cry in the corner. I feel you. I've been there. Take a second and then come back when you're ready. Right. Something as simple as that and trying to understand their perspective and where they're coming from is invaluable. Like you can't forget that part of training the female student athlete, right? Like they just respond to life differently than men just because of their different life experiences, you know? And I think that's an important thing to take into consideration and just understand that like you don't need to treat them differently than the men. You can train them the same way. You can expect the same things from them as the men, right? Like you can hold them accountable. You can discipline them when things aren't going well. But also at the same time, like understand that like their emotional response to situations doesn't necessarily mean that they're weak or bad or they're not focused. Maybe just like they're having a really bad day for some reason and like they're struggling to figure out how to express themselves, you know? And I'm hoping as we go through this, people, you know, you see this in like the news, right? Like when female athletes are competing, they get upset, like, and they express emotion, like they throw like their tennis racket down or they take off their shirt at the end of a soccer game because they're excited that they just scored the goal, right? Everyone's first to criticize and like, oh, why are they having that emotional outburst? Like, why are they acting like that? Oh, that angry person. But the men, right? No issues when the men do that. And so I think people just need to get comfortable with the fact that like women have emotions and it's okay to express that and it's going to come out in a variety of different ways. And that's how athletes are, is like they're competitive, emotional, intense people, or else they wouldn't be where they are, right? They wouldn't be competing in a Division 1 setting at a Power 5 school. They wouldn't be competing in the Olympics at the highest level of their sport if they didn't have that part of them, you know? And so it's like for me it's so important to manage that and to understand that and to give them the freedom and the safety and the space to feel like it's okay to express that and it's okay to feel these ways. You know, it's okay to come in and crying and to be frustrated because your training session didn't go well. It's okay to be upset that you got hurt, you know. And that's something that I think men coaching females, right, again, it's not everybody, but I think that oftentimes they struggle with that because they don't know what to do, right? Like a crying female comes to you and like they get nervous. And I'm like, just embrace it, man. Like it's a part of it. Or like if women swear when like they're working out, you know, it's not crude or foul. Like they just, you know, maybe it was just a heavy rep and they just need to let some intensity out, you know? And it's just like you got to give them the space to be who they are and let them know it's okay to be who they are. And it's okay to have these emotional responses. And it's not a reflection of you as a person. It's just like, this is life. And sometimes life is difficult, you know?
Yeah, for sure, and I don't like, me as a college golfer, I've definitely been one of those student athletes that just came crying into the weight room, and I don't know why, maybe I don't know whether it was the time of the day, but yeah, like, even as a strength and conditioning intern later on, like, I would just constantly see that, and yeah, definitely the coaches that I've seen, make a really big impact on their athletes were the ones that took time to say, "Hey, how are you?" or "Hey, what's up?" Like, or just, acknowledge that emotional response or emotional, I guess, reaction to the situation and whatnot. Our final question, wrapping up now as we're about to head into the hour. Final question is like, you've talked about, your experience, heading into this male dominated industry. In terms of, female looking for job opportunities, and I'm sure you get this question a lot, being like the first female football strength and conditioning coach at Cal, or just sports science practitioner out there. Yeah, what's your advice to females coming into the industry, and also like in terms of, let's say, if you have any interns, people looking into doing an internship with Cal. I know it's not really your decision, but like what would you typically look for in terms of people who want to work in that industry?
Yeah. It's going to sound really basic, right? But it's about networking, right? Like proactively get out there and talk to people in the industry that you want to join before you want to go
Oops. Sorry, Cher, we lost you a little bit
sports
there.
science in a collegiate setting. Like figure out who is doing it right now and start reaching out to them, right? Even just having casual conversations to be like, hey, I want to learn more about what your day to day looks like and what like the qualities
Yeah.
and those intrinsic, soft skills that you need to be successful in it. And if you do that, I think that that will provide the most value, right? Is because one, you start networking. So if something pops up, they'll think of you and be like, oh, so and so had already contacted me and they're interested in this. Like, let's see if they still are, right? And so that's really the biggest thing I would recommend is just like reach out to the people who are doing what you want to do in the industry and the setting that you want to do before
Mm,
you actually want a job, right? And build that relationship, understand the demands of that sport, understand the realities of what the job is going to entail, right? Because you might think you want to do this, but then when you get in here and realize all the stuff that you have to do that's not sexy, that's not exciting, the hours can be pretty long, the stress can be pretty high, you might realize that you actually don't want to pursue this, And so I think it's important to get a feel for the realities of the profession you want to enter before you decide that you're going to do that because it's not always what you think it's going to be. So, like reach out to people, network contact. I was able to get an opportunity with Cal football because I'd already met with their entire strength and conditioning staff prior to me reaching out to them, inquiring about an internship, right? Like I just met with them because they worked at Cal and I love Cal and I just wanted to know the people who worked here, right? And it ended up being a good situation for me down the road, So like don't overcomplicate things. I just think the best way to go about it, and like everybody will have a different opinion about this, but for me, it's just talk to people, just network, get to know them, right? Like, and that's a good place to start. Everything else is like, if you have the education and the knowledge, right? All that stuff that you can learn online, obviously very important, right? But if you can start learning how to do these soft skills and develop that side of it, where you need a job where you can apply all that education and that information you learned in school or all the research that you read, then you're going to be in a really good spot to be successful when you actually get that opportunity. So I'd say network, reach out, just try and learn as much as you can and pick their brain, right? Instead of going in day one being like, I want a job. Can I work for you? Maybe day one going, hey, look, I'd love to learn more about what you're doing, um, and go from there.
right. Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, our time's about to come to an end. But yeah, thank you so much, Cheryl, for spending this hour with us and, answering my questions, answering these people's our participants' questions. Yeah, thank you everybody for being here with us today. I know some of us it's an inconvenient hour, but we're all here for the love of science and the love of women in sport and learning. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day. Our next speaker will be Jamie from Newcastle United. We will be having this series for the next few weeks, every Wednesday and Thursday. So hope to see the rest of you guys